I want to sell you on left-wing politics. That probably sounds like an oxymoron, the idea of buying and selling being considered the home turf of neoliberal capitalism. But ideas and philosophies can be sold to people just as much as goods or services can. Between the collapse of the United Soviet Socialist Republics and the humanitarian disasters in Venezuela and other ostensibly socialist countries, not to mention the ever-spiralling insanity of the identitarian left around the Western world, this is obviously going to be a hard sell. Opening up by telling you what I intend to do is not a great way to win you over either, as your defences will be up and you'll already be churning assumptions in your head about what left-wing means, about what socialism means. In many ways, it does feel like we're in a post-left world, that neoliberal capitalism dominates the globe, and that any alternative ideas about how to organise society, industry, or politics lack credibility due to these failures. One need only look to the White House to see writ large and orange the feckless, greedy, corrupt, nationalistic myopia that seems to distinguish the victorious 21st century right wing, right through its denial and resistance of progress. The very concept of progress itself seems to have disappeared, replaced by iterations of virtually the same thing, refinements of products, political parties chasing the middle, new ways of keeping to the old ways and trying to patch everything together and keep going. Ignoring the various technological, environmental and economic walls we're all about to hit, and which demand innovation and progress rather than sticking to the old ways. Let all of that go. Let those ideas fall away, because these disastrous collapses in ostensibly socialist countries, their authoritarian control, and the blatant racism, sexism and bigotry of the modern intersectional left goes against centuries of left-wing thought, to the extent that they can't be considered a reflection of left-wing philosophy any more than fascism can be thought to be an accurate reflection of the centre-right. Historically, very broadly speaking, the left wing refers back to the time of the French Revolution. While there had been rebellions, revolts, and ideas that we might recognise as left-wing going back to the times of the plague, this is where we got the terminology. Those who sought to reform or overthrow the progressives were on the left-hand side of the chamber, while the traditionalists and royalists sat upon the right. The radical liberalism and socialist tendencies in the French Revolution would go on to inspire English radicals, who would then become Americans and create the United States. Left-wing and socialist thought is a natural outgrowth of liberalism and a continuance thereof, and strands of that thought, though this will horrify many Americans, are very definitely present in their constitution and other documents. It's important here to distinguish, yet again, between the Marxist Johnny-come-lately concept of socialism and hence of the left, from the non-Marxist meaning. Marxists, ironically referring to themselves as scientific socialists, mean control of the means of production by the working class when they say socialism, usually embodied, at least in theory, by the state acting on the behalf of the workers. Socialism in the utopian socialist sense, the pre-Marxist sense, or pre- and post-communist sense, the democratically socialist sense, is more about some basic general principles of cooperation, equality and anti-authoritarianism, though you'd be hard-pressed to get that accurate description out of many people these days, even on the left. The American left isn't even left-wing in global terms, captured by corporations and afraid to let their progressive wing do anything. When, against all odds, what passes for their left suggests a grand and useful scheme like a Green New Deal, they tack a load of unrelated and hard-to-pass guff onto it and it gets shot down. In the UK, Our leader of the opposition, Magic Grandpa, is utterly politically inept, and even in the slow-rolling disaster of Brexit has failed to properly exploit the weakness of the government to push a progressive agenda. Elsewhere, seemingly everywhere, there is what will almost certainly be a short-term slide to traditionalism and right-wing thought, regress rather than progress, and disappointingly, almost as much of that regress seems to come from the left in name only, as well as the right. But I don't particularly want to dwell on the weaknesses of the modern pseudo-left, nor fearmonger about the modern right, or what the loss of left-wing institutions might mean. If Brexit has taught us anything, it's that a positive argument needs to be made for things, not just a negative or threatening one. Political and social issues aren't like hanging warning signs on a power transformer. You need to tell people, you need to sell people on the plus side of not being electrocuted, not just relying on a sign that says danger of death. One of the defining aspects of left-wing thought, perhaps the defining idea, is that of equality. This doesn't seem like such a revolutionary idea today, because we have, for the most part, accepted the idea that we're equal, at least in the ways that matter. Many people, critics of the left, and sadly some within its number, think that equality must necessarily mean homogeneity. That's not the idea, and was never really the idea, save in some particularly ideologically orthodox versions of communism, such as that of Pol Pot. Being equal doesn't have to mean being the same. It doesn't mean everyone in grey jumpsuits in identical houses. Being equal doesn't have to mean all getting paid the same, or being valued the same, or having the same capabilities and capacities. It's not a Harrison Bergeron future. The idea of equality is that we're all on an equal footing, that rich or poor, commoner or nobility, clergy or layman, that we have equal legal and social standing without preferential treatment for one or the other, insomuch as is humanly possible around our biological differences. This can mean equality before the law, meaning that no matter your standing or wealth, race, creed or colour, you have a right to a fair trial, the same as everyone else, and to be considered innocent until proven guilty. A common phrase one hears from the classical liberal tribe is that of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. But this is absolutely a left-wing idea. There are extremists who do seek homogeneity on the left, just as there are absolute 100% granular social Darwinist libertarians on the economic right, but you can't judge the whole from the extremes. I would hope that we can form an agreement across a broad swathe of political opinion that, ideally, we want to live in a world where a brilliant scientific mind born into the poorest family in the ghetto has as much chance to flower and use their gift for the betterment of themselves and humanity as a pedestrian intellect born into a rich family, and the same goes for art or whatever else. But is that the world we live in? I don't believe we do. How could we get to such a world? Well, we've already taken some steps towards it. Modern nations tend to have compulsory schooling and a system of public schooling. This provides a set of national and international standards, recognised qualifications, a unified curriculum, and in theory, being accessible to everyone, provides our ghetto Tesla the chance to flower to the full potential of their talent. The idea of universal public education is a left-wing and progressive one. It's also vital to the smooth running of a modern egalitarian democracy, that its citizens are informed enough to consider, judge and make political decisions. In practice, however, we know this simply isn't true. These aims have been eroded. People are frequently ignorant, misinformed or disinformed. Higher education is often out of reach financially or scholastically, yet is almost considered necessary for even the most basic of positions in work. Commercialised higher learning is taken out of the reach of the poor, and how much you can afford on rent or housing will often determine the quality of the teaching institution you might attend, because the area determines the school. Right from the most basic induction in primary school right the way through to high school, these things affect you. The cost of uniforms, school clothes, PE gear, classroom equipment and so on is all extra, and richer schools in richer areas can tap the parents for the extra funding that they need through fundraisers, further improving them over their impoverished compatriots. How do you fix this? Well, you don't do it by dragging every school down to the lower level. It takes an investment of money, the valuing of teachers, decent salaries for them, and a lot more. It takes money and what money represents. Money best raised, most fairly raised by tax revenue, so that both rich and poor can have a more equal chance to thrive. It also means opening up education to allow for different aptitudes and styles of learning. Apprenticeships in practical skills should mean as much as academics, and we can't just plug the gap with corporate partnerships because all they're interested in are compliant, profitable worker drones. The only way to do this is collectively with social investment via taxes. Economy of scale, the sheer size of the educational sector, for example, makes this the most cost-effective way, whereas private education is extremely costly and creates a two-tier system. We have a similar two-tier system in law, despite everyone being, in theory, equal before the law and having a right to representation. In the UK, legal aid, assistance for those who can't afford it to get legal redress when they're wronged, has been gutted. In the USA, we see rules being unevenly applied to the rich and the famous as opposed to the poor and disenfranchised, which often overlaps with racial minorities due to history. The best way to deal with this? Well, again, collectivization, universalism, and intervention with collective wealth to ensure that the underprivileged have as much access to justice and redress as the wealthy so that they cannot be so easily exploited. Healthcare, again, is something where we end up with a two-tier system, one thing for the wealthy, the other for the poor. Even in the UK, where the NHS is a beloved institution that people are more than willing to pay for, even here, people with private insurance get to jump queues and otherwise get preferential treatment, albeit the private health insurance is cheaper here because it sits on the back of the NHS. Triage is supposed to mean helping those who need it most first, not those with the deepest pockets. In the USA it's even worse, with the citizens of America paying a lot more money than the citizens of the UK, albeit privately, for a much worse service with worse outcomes overall. All of that for an illusion of choice and the constant threat of bankruptcy. Even much poorer nations than the US that take a socialised approach avoid many of the problems the USA has by concentrating on preventative care, which is extremely cost effective. While many in the States avoid going to the doctor until their symptoms are unmanageable, worried about the cost, the irony is that more money would be saved, more people would be saved, if they could see their doctors at the start and get an early diagnosis. Health isn't a meaningful marketplace. The right to life is the most fundamental of universal rights. Rich or poor, you either need medical assistance or you don't. You can't just choose to ignore an illness. Which isn't to say that markets can't do wonderful things in other spheres. They're just not the universal panacea that the libertarians seem to think they are. Capitalism and socialism are complementary in mixed economies. The capitalist side provides wealth, the socialist side distributes that wealth in the most cost-effective and equality-creating manner. Some people refuse to acknowledge that this is left-wing, refuse to acknowledge that this is socialism, and call it welfare capitalism. Well, call it what you want, but it is an outgrowth of socialist and left-wing thought. So much of this works so much better in more socialist nations like the Scandinavian ones, and yes, they are socialist, because of three important factors. Universalism, the idea that everyone has the same rights and should have the same baseline treatment. Economy of scale, the more of something you get, the more economical it becomes. Removal of conflict, with their responsibility to the public in many arenas rather than shareholders or business owners or the bottom line. Many potential ethical conflicts, examples of favoritism, are removed. The other thing that the Scandinavian nations do very well is that they operate their government on multiple levels. So local issues are resolved locally, regional issues are resolved regionally, national issues nationally, and so on. Universalism is something the modern pseudo-left has forgotten in its rush to create a patchwork of special rights and considerations for different identity groups, all but guaranteeing inequality however they excuse it. The right excuses it with discredited social Darwinism, or on the basis that they, and the listener, somehow thinks they'll never be at the sharp end of it. Economy of scale should be easy to understand. If a hospital or a national health service is ordering a quadrillion cotton swabs, then they're obviously going to get a better per unit price than you buying a box of 100 from the store directly. Maybe try thinking of it in terms of pizza. Say you and a friend are hungry of a Friday night after a partaking, and you each have £10. With that, you could each get a personal 7-inch pizza and a garlic bread to split between you. Or, if you club together, you can get a meal deal. You could get two 11.5-inch medium pizzas and a garlic bread for the same price. That's getting on for 3 times the square footage of pizza if you bought it individually for the same price, because of the economy of scale. You might have to give up a little on customization or particular flavours that aren't part of the order, but everyone gets more pizza and everyone benefits. Socialised medicine is a meal deal pizza with a free side. Given that this is such a no-brainer, it's peculiar that some states are sliding away from socialised healthcare and others, like the USA, are mightily resistant to its adoption. This is because money is power, and a lot of people have a lot of power in the form of money tied up in and coming from the healthcare industry, because people can't afford not to have healthcare. So the money and the power, not just in healthcare but across society, is accumulated in a very few hands, who then have a disproportionate amount of control over government policy, even the media, the capacity to swing opinion and so on, which often leads people to vote against their own best interests, far too often. And that's why you'll often find progressive taxation and redistribution of wealth being so important in left-wing political parties. The right wing's fine with redistribution of wealth as well, it's just they're fine with redistribution in the opposite direction, from the poor to the rich rather than the rich to the poor. It's not just a matter that the rich can afford to pay more, it's that paying more means a lot less to them. If you have a grand total of £10 to your name and I take £1 in tax, I've severely impacted the options available to you in life. If you have £10 billion to your name and I take £1 billion, you are not in any meaningful way impacted. You can still buy everything you could ever need several times over. That £1 billion is worth far more, even if it's just in the form of a pound, to a billion people who only have £10 to their name. Small changes for people who are poor can make huge differences. Big changes for people who are rich often has no meaningful impact. So if we go back to the pizza example, you can already see that by clubbing together, everyone gets more pizza. So much more pizza that if you have a third friend who couldn't afford to contribute, you could still give him a couple of slices and have more pizza left than if you'd bought it separately. Collectivization and the economies it brings with it also creates capacity in the system to aid the less fortunate and to invest in the fabric of society itself. And it's more cost effective when it's done collectively than in separate philanthropic ways of going about things. Read Dickens. Wealth, and hence power, tends to accumulate and stick in the top tiers of society and not recirculate and perform work. In laissez-faire capitalist systems, it just tends to stick at the top. Progressive taxation and redistributing that wealth means it tends to go much more into being spent and used, driving work, doing work, and thus contributing to better circumstances for everyone and making the economy function. Much of it, if it's being put to work, is also being recaptured by taxation and therefore can be pumped back into the system again, so it feeds upon itself. That social investment taking from the top and feeding into the bottom for training, schooling, housing, medicine and more creates that equality of opportunity. That equality of opportunity that I think we can agree on should be the aim of our society. It's also a far more cost-effective way of dealing with crime and other social issues than policing or taking away people's rights or expanding stop and search laws, which tend to create more problems than they solve. As a thought experiment that's sometimes performed as a sort of litmus test for society, if you were to be randomly born into the world now, which nation, which society would you want to be born into? What changes would you make if you didn't know if you were about to be born into a racial or other minority, or into poverty, or into wealth? Most people would answer that they'd prefer to be born into a more egalitarian society that invests in its people, its infrastructure, which provides equal opportunities so that you have a chance to flourish and to do well. No matter where you were born, who you turned out to be. That's what left-wing politics and socialist reforms can offer. That greatest amount of chance, that greatest amount of freedom for the greatest number. Left-wing as a term, or worse yet, socialist, usually conjures images of dystopian, labyrinthine bureaucracies and hierarchical members of the party, especially in Americans who have been trained wrong as a joke since the 1950s and the McCarthy era. The dominance of Marxism in left-wing thought hasn't helped either, at least not in application, and the effect that their practices in the form of states, that effect has been nightmarish. But then that can be said of just about any political ideology. Capitalism's hands are not blood-free, nor is any other system. This is particularly odd, though, when you consider the overall arc of left-wing progressivism and revolutionary thought. There's a verse in the well-known hymn All Things Bright and Beautiful that rather demonstrates the pre-socialist mindset. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly, and ordered their estate. Rather ironically, this hymn was first published in 1848, a time of enormous revolutionary social upheaval across Europe, aimed at the overthrowing of the very monarchical and ecclesiastical order that this verse was praising. Aristocracy before then ruled by divine right. This was only really smashed by the First World War. The natural order was seen as being sacrosanct, and people as being set in their place. You were where you needed to be. The rise of industry smashed that to a degree, but social upheaval had to follow technological upheaval as the middle class and urban working class expanded, and the nouveau riche formed and wanted respect. The doing away with that old order, and many tyrannical regimes since, has largely been the purview of the left. Even in the overthrow of ostensibly left-wing tyrannies in the former Soviet bloc, it was mostly left liberal rebellions attacking hierarchies that led to their downfall. Perhaps there's something in Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution. Even when you look at some of the most famous and disappointing revolutions, such as the October Revolution or the Cuban Revolution, it makes sense to look at the absolute state of those nations before the communist takeovers. I doubt Venezuela will return to its pre-Chavez state of exploitation and remarkable wealth division even after the current regime falls. And people just won't tolerate it now. They've had a taste of fairness. Anyway, the point is that left-wing politics is, or should be, innately anti-hierarchical. If everyone is equal before the law and has equal opportunity, then why should the rich or the blue-blooded rule? They are not necessarily any better as people, as politicians, as moral agents than anyone else, as Trump certainly makes very plain by his existence, albeit unintentionally. Besides this innate resistance to hierarchy, left-wing thought tends to posit a fairly limited role for the state. Even in communism so-called, the idea after everything is brought under state control in the name of the people is that then the state will wither away, leaving everything directly in the hands of the people in a truly free society. It never quite works out that way, of course. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Place all the levers of society in the hands of a party chairman, then he's going to be tempted. Still, the intent in utopian socialism, in democratic socialism, is that the state has a very limited role. That of an administrator, a distributor, an arbiter and regulator. The state's role is not to rule per se, but to ensure that there is equitable and sufficient distribution of resources, goods, medicine, education, recreation time, and so on as equal terms as is possible to maximize opportunity and quality of life. It sets a lower bound. It also separates the state from nationalism, which is an aspect of the state, from religion, from ceremony. The state is reduced to the status and role of a manager and a conflict resolver. A limited state is hardly, then, the spectre of Orwell's Big Brother, whereas, oddly enough, right-wing economics is extremely vulnerable to cronyism, corruption and corporatism, unless it's well regulated by a balancing force, such as a regulatory government. The ideal in this is, obviously, democratic socialism, where the state is responsive to and responsible to the people, where it can be held to account in a way that private or corrupt institutions can't be, where the collective responsibility is that of a caretaker, not to make the most money by hook or by crook, and ethics be damned, which is the danger of the paperclip optimizer for money that corporations are as social machines. Their only duty is to consume and make money, and everything else can go to hell by and large. Plus, corporate organisations are so expansive and unresponsive that nobody needs to take responsibility individually for what the company does. People think left-wing necessarily has to mean an expansive and nannying state, but it's liberal and left-wing thought and progress that has, until very recently, pushed the state out of interference in what you can say, what you can think, where you can put your genitals, and other intrusions that existed under more traditionally conservative auspices. If we have to have a state, and without a post-scarcity society it's hard to see how we can do without one, pragmatism suggests that we do need a state, then a limited and accountable state, as posited in left-wing and socialist thought, would seem to be the best option in a mixed economy. People exert control over each other in a variety of different ways, and different levels and different degrees. The oppressor-oppressed dynamic that the intersectional pseudo-left puts forward is a clumsy way of understanding this. Kyriarchy, the interplay of different advantages and disadvantages, is a little bit better. But people do exert physical, intellectual, social, monetary, and other forms of dominance over each other. Religious belief can be used to dominate and control others, control over someone's wages, the threat of public shaming, and so on. This kind of hierarchical structure is probably inescapable, but left-wing thought seeks to dismantle unjust hierarchical rule in pursuit of the aforementioned equality. So these kind of small-scale interaction dominance games aren't, or shouldn't be, its concern. It's when a new hierarchical power emerges with disproportionate strength and begins to override the rights and concerns of others. That's where something has to step in. This is why the left has traditionally been the one to dismantle monarchies and dictatorships, to challenge sexual repression and censorship. It's no small source of concern to me that the current era pseudo-left seems to be promoting all the things that it should be against, creating bizarre, inverted hierarchies of the oppressed, judging people based on their colour, sexuality, gender, and so on, the things we used to fight against, calling for more censorship, creating more prudishness, creating an aristocracy of woke academics and a red guard of social media fanatics across every industry and every social platform you could hope to think of, seeking out people to punish so that they can prove their own credentials. This is all antithetical to the baseline philosophy of left-wing thought, which has long been associated with free expression, free love, freedom of all kinds. Maximum freedom for everyone, without control, oppression or repression. And it harm none, do as thou wilt. Contrary to the thoughts of many conservatives, and Marxists to be fair, this doesn't necessitate the abolition of private property, just the taking of measures to prevent or minimise the emergence of a plutocracy, and to ensure that those born into disadvantage aren't actually born into disadvantage, and that any natural talents they might have can take them as far as they can. Inheritance is a thorny issue here. I'm not saying any system is perfect, but an ordered and fair society needs to tackle these problems. This motivation can mean many different things, and it can be enacted to varying degrees. It might or might not include the nationalisation of particular industries. It might mean the state ends up running important infrastructure like water and power. It might not. It might mean curtailing or confiscating all, part, or nothing from inheritances, depending how big they are, how big the dynasty is. This is to help prevent a hereditary ruling class from re-emerging and taking control of society. It might include breaking up monopolies, oligarchies and cartels, preventing too much economic and social power accumulating in one place, as we're seeing with social media companies today. Left-wing thought. Non-Marxist socialism needn't be oppressive. Indeed, many of the freedoms we now take for granted, the equality that we now take for granted, stems from left-wing and socialist thought as an outgrowth of the liberal and libertine spirit of the 18th century, the Enlightenment and the concept of progress. That the left has today lost its way, descended into a postmodern mire, eschewed progressive values for regressive values. This doesn't change history or philosophy, nor does it change the fact that these things have given us so much in the past and promise to give us a lot more in the future. Equality before the law, extended voting franchises, healthcare infrastructure, a more equal chance, not just to survive but thrive, are things that we've been given in the past from this political wing. Universal basic income, increased leisure time, all of these kinds of things could come about through more technological progress in the future. But unless we have a political wing fighting to distribute the benefits of that technology, we're just going to end up with robber barons again. This racism we see on the regressive left, these hierarchical patterns, they're an aberration, probably temporary. And there is a left that doesn't include that. A left that's libertine, that's fun, wants to maximize rather than limit freedom, that believes in what it argues and is willing to argue it. The answer to the regressive left is a progressive left, not a regressive right that excuses and extols inequality and makes traditionalism arguments. Everyone thinks that they'd be a prince in a state of nature, and nobody thinks that they'd be a pauper. But the presence of princes necessitates the existence of paupers. Don't give up on the left. Embrace it for what it truly is through its history, a pragmatic, proven way to progress to more rights, more freedoms, a better, happier world for everybody.
La orquesta.